A. Okay, so eliminating wordiness and redundancy. Basically, guys, this just means let's take out the stuff that just repeats itself over and over again. If it's not necessary to make it make sense, then we don't need it, okay? For instance, number 1 says the Great Migration was the largest, biggest mass movement of people in the U.S. history. Well, we've got 3 words right here that all mean basically the same thing. It's big, right? I don't need to see big 3 times to understand that it's big. So what am I going to do? I'm going to get rid of something. So it was the largest. All right, let's take out biggest and mass. Now it says the Great Migration was the largest movement of people in U.S. history. Suddenly, it sounds a lot better. It's a lot more precise, and I'm not getting lost in all of the extra, okay? So, the Great Migration was the largest movement of people in U.S. history. In the early 1900s, at the turn of the century, most African Americans lived in the South. Well, guys, if it's the early 1900s, that is the turn of the century. The beginning of a new century is what we call the turn of the century. So if I'm saying the early 1900s, I already know this part. I don't need it. That just cut out all of that extra, and instead I've got, in the early 1900s, most African Americans lived in the South. In the early 1900s, most African Americans lived in the South. Okay? They worked as sharecroppers, farming the land as part of the sharecropper system. Guys, if they're sharecroppers, they're part of the sharecropper system. We literally can get rid of all of that. They worked as sharecroppers. The end. They worked as sharecroppers. So now, the Great Migration was the largest movement of people in U.S. history. In the early 1900s, most African Americans lived in the South. They worked as sharecroppers. That sounds a lot better than all of that extra craziness that was in there before. Friends, you don't want to change the main idea, okay? You want to make sure that all of the important information is there, but you lose your reader when you add extra, okay? The idea is not to pack the most amount of words into a sentence. The idea is to get your point across in the most educated yet concise way, okay? Small package with lots of information versus a giant box with a lot of fluff, all right? So let's keep going. All right, so in number 1, African American people and families wanted to live free from poverty and violence. Okay, what can we get that down to? Can we get that down any further? Well, African American people and families. Well, do we need people and families? That seems a little extra. Wanted to live free, I feel like I could fit a different word in there. Instead of to live free, we could say freedom. Let's see. African American people and their families wanted to live free from violence. Well, that's too much because poverty doesn't necessarily mean violence. We took too much out there. Can't be A. African American families were free from poverty. That's not what that said at all. African American people and families wanted to live free. Free from what? African American families wanted freedom from poverty and violence. Right there. This says the same thing that this did, just in a more tightly packaged sentence. D should have been your answer. And number 2, newspaper ads telling about jobs that were located in the North and West were able to convince people to move to those areas of the country. Newspaper ads for jobs in the North and West convinced people to move to those regions. Regions instead of those areas of the country. Were located. That seems a little extra. Were able to convinced. This one looks like a good contender, but let's check the other ones and make sure. Newspaper ads for jobs were able to convince people to move to those areas of the country. That one's not going to work. That one took out way too much. What areas of the country? What kind of... What are we doing here? Newspapers that were located in the North and West. Well, were the newspapers located in North and West? No. This said about the jobs that were there. So that one's not going to work. Newspaper ads were able to convince people to move to those areas of the North and West. I don't like that one either. Sounds to me like A is our best option. All right. Number 3. Sometimes one family member moved first. Later, the whole family was reunited together. Sometimes one family moved. Later, they were reunited together. Well, if the whole family moved, then why do they need to be reunited? That doesn't work out. Excuse me. Sometimes one family member moved and was reunited. Moved and was reunited with what? Nope, that's too much. Sometimes one family member moved first. Later, the whole family was reunited. That feels like it tells me what I need to know, but let's check D just to be safe. Sometimes one family member and the whole family reunited later. Y'all, that doesn't even make sense. All right, so our only viable option here is C. Check, make sure you have C as your answer. By 1970, the year the Great Migration is considered to have ended, the South was home to fewer than half of all African Americans in the United States. When the Great Migration ended in 1970, yeah, that did a pretty good job of breaking that all down. Fewer than half of all African Americans lived in the South. That looks like it could be a good contender, but let's hold on and see. By 1970, the year the Great Migration ended, few African Americans lived in the South. That's not what it said. It said fewer than half, but that's still a lot of people, not few people. C, the Great Migration is when the South was home to fewer than half of all African Americans in the United States. Y'all, no. That sentence made my head hurt just trying to read it. By 1970, the year the Great Migration is considered to have ended, the South was home to half of all African Americans in the United States. That one's worse than we started with. So our only viable answer here was A. Check yours, make sure that's what you have. All right. So second page is just some more practice of the same thing we already had. One neighbor who lives in the house next door has been the recipient of an invitation to the governor's ball. Friends, if the neighbor lives next door, we're going to call that our next door neighbor. Has been the recipient of an invitation to the governor's ball. Well, if they've been a recipient, that means they received it, right? So our next door neighbor received an invitation to the governor's ball. Okay. The pies were baked by the parents of the second graders. How about the second graders' parents Notice I put my apostrophe after the S. Graders is plural. That apostrophe makes it possessive because it's their parents. Baked the pies. Oh, that sounds much more like something we would actually say. The sarcastic remarks that Linda delivered had the effect of causing everyone to become angry. Very angry. Oh. How about Linda's sarcastic remarks made everyone angry? That's what we said, isn't it? So, Linda's sarcastic excuse me, remarks made everyone angry. Okay. Aluminum is a metal that is very light in weight. Okay. Aluminum. Oh, the metal. Aluminum is very light. Okay. The office manager wanted all the memos to be typed. She wanted all the memos to be typed so that they would be easy to read. We sure don't need 2 sentences for that. How about the office manager wanted all of the memos to be typed so that they would be easy to read? We just cut all of this out. The office manager wanted all the memos to be typed so that they would be easy to read. He found his neighbor who lived next door and was 30 years old to be attractive in appearance. How about he found his next door neighbor or he found his 30-year-old next door neighbor to be attractive. He found his 30-year-old next door neighbor to be attractive. One time when I went to the park, my friend, whose name is Jake, went with me and we had fun. One time, my friend Jake went to the park with me and we had fun. One time, my friend Jake and I went to the park to have fun. One time, my friend Jake and I had fun at the park. All of those would be acceptable answers, guys. But do you see what we're doing here? These sentences have too much going on. We got to take it down a notch, okay? You're fine on the last two. I'm sure you did fantastic, okay? Make sure that you have followed through on this and you have an understanding of what you're doing before you take your unit test. Got it? All right. Good luck. You've done great. I believe in you.